Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F. Today, we are so excited to talk about Mithras and the secret cult of Saturn and Imperial Rome with author, researcher, poet, and essayist Peter Mark Adams to talk about some of these key issues and questions that you may have, listeners, if this is the first time you're hearing this. Who is Mithras? What were the Mithraic mysteries practiced thousands of years ago? How was the cult organized, and what role did Orphic metaphysics have to play, as well as frescoes and architecture in communicating its mysteries? Well, as always, listeners, Peter Mark Adams is the perfect person to ask. Peter is an author, a poet, an essayist specializing in the anthography and visuality of ritual, sacred landscape, esotericism, consciousness, and healing. And as you know, listeners, he's no stranger to the podcast because he shared his incredible research on a menagerie of different topics at this point. The Solabuska Taroki, the Hagia Sophia in Turkey, where he resides, as well as the incredible healing work that Peter and his partner Kenzie practice every single day in order to help others. So in this episode, Peter is generously taking his time and sharing his wisdom to talk about his latest tome, Ritual and Epiphany in the Mysteries of Mithras, the secret cult of Saturn and Imperial Rome. And I'm so excited to dive into this. So all that being said,
Alex, let me just put the book up. There it is.
There you go. Perfect. There it is, Peter. Someone who literally needs no introduction, Peter, because I know that people are just as excited as I am. Thank you just so much for taking the time. And
it's my pleasure. It's always a big pleasure to chat with you, Alex.
The honor's mine. Sometimes I'll be at the grocery store. Sometimes I'll be doing something totally not even involved in us, and your voice will pop into my head. It'll be something from the game of Saturn or something on the architecture of the Hagia Sophia. So you haunt me in the best way possible, Peter Mark Adams. But the reason why I think you benignly haunt so many people is you take these topics and you dive right in. I mean, you really do approach things in such an engaging way. It just pulls you into the orbit of your research. And when it comes to the mysteries of Mithras, can you kind of take us back as you did with the Solabuska and the Hagia Sophia? What was the genesis point of this? Like, how did you first say, I need to explore this cult in Imperial Rome?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really difficult question to answer because my engagement has gone on for so long with it. I can count like 50 odd years. Never consistent, but off and on, and with varying degrees of understanding and depth, So it's like this cult has these octopus tentacles that like reach out and get me, and it's been ongoing for so many decades now. Finally, the time came to focus on the cult and really sort out a solid foundation for my understanding of it. And as I say, that timing was like, I don't know, it comes out of another place. It's like a timeline crosses my biographical timeline and says, okay, here's the time where you deal with this now. And that's how it's been with me. I can't really put a date on when I first engaged with it. It's so long ago. So complex answer to a simple question.
Well, and that is, which is exactly why I think your research and your books are so powerful. And of course, having that theme in many of your works of Saturn. And one of the things that I think really inspires me reading your work too, Peter, is you approach your research in the past, but also in this particular tome, from an emic perspective or an insider's perspective.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, especially if someone out there might be listening for the first time and they might be wondering, well, did Peter jump in a time machine and travel back thousands of years, or how do you approach it as an with an emic perspective? What does that mean?
I think part of it is an acute kind of sensitivity to iconography, and it's almost like a poetic sensibility. I think Robert Graves talked about this quite extensively in The White Goddess, actually, how he was able to construct or reconstruct entire conversations from the Roman era. Like they just like came to him. So there is that dynamic. And we should never like dismiss that engagement and allowing our sensitivity to reach out and embrace times past is actually a very fruitful way of engaging with material. And that gives you an insider's view immediately. So, I think there's good reason why that mechanism, let's call it, works. And it's to do with the field and with the universality of consciousness as one of the fundamental building or the fundamental building block of the universe. So that we're in a process, a poetic process of allowing our, the flame of our innermost mind to reach out and embrace what is in essence a timeless zone, because duration only exists for us as biological creatures. It doesn't exist infinitely or absolutely. So all times are co-present if we'll allow ourselves to engage with them. So that's the kind of esoteric take on answer to your question, Alex. But there's an awful lot of research goes into this work. As you may know, Gameless Saturn took 3 years of day, 7 days a week, hours every day, 10, 12 hours a day. And then it yields its mysteries. The Hagia Sophia I've been engaged with for 30 years before I wrote the book. So the engagement is on many planes. It's also reading the academic sources. You need to know what's been said. And generally, I think for most esotericists, that is kind of foundational, but it always stops short of what we're interested in. Yeah, it does. It just doesn't. They talk about rituals, but they never engage with rituals. It's never that inner dimension. Is always missing from academic work. So I never dismiss it. It's so important to know what's being researched, what's being said. But then you need to take that step beyond it, and that comes from a different level. I think I've been fortunate with the mystery cults generally because they still survive. Okay. And I'm thinking specifically of the Indo-Tibetan Higher Yoga Tantra, the Vajrayana tradition. And my own Usui Reiki tradition emerged out of Tendai Buddhism. Okay. And that is the Japanese Vajrayana. So having been initiated into that tradition and doing the healing work and initiating other people, this is a living tradition. It's not something, lost in the past, so to speak. You connect to divinity and you allow it to flow through you to other people. So that is like the core of the mysteries is this, that the initiators are, in essence, devotees of a deity and allow it to flow through them to others. Okay, so the ritual space is simply a space which is conducive to this transfer, to this emission. And I can say whenever I was doing Reiki initiations, the room would be would change its aspect prior to the initiation, knowing that is going to happen. The presences are in the room. The temperature within yourself rises, you can feel the energy. And a kind of quiet emerges around the ritual space. It's like all the distractions, dogs stop barking, cats, they go asleep, all this kind of stuff arranges itself to allow the initiation to proceed. And, when I got this kind of teacher level initiation, it was in the circle of Stonehenge. And, the English weather is not too good at the best of times. It was very overcast, and we all went into the circle there. But we did the initiation. It was like 30 odd people with William Rand. It was his tradition, which is very close to the Usui family tradition. So the lineage is very pure. And it took a long, long time for him to go around 30 odd people, But when we were walking out, I just looked up, and there, right above Stonehenge Circle, was clear blue sky, a circle of clear blue sky in the midst of all these like stormy and rain drenched clouds waiting to pour down. So yeah, the ritual space is a very special one, working with deities and with divine presences. So that's what gives me the insider perspective, this direct experience of initiation, of energy in its various manifestations, and how the process unfolds, and what are the prerequisites for it to unfold in a healthy way.
That's what I absolutely love. I'm reminded when I read your work of King Lear himself when he says crack nature's molds, and all of the elements, because you really do shatter it for me. When I read it, you revivify the tradition, but it's not even a revivification because you remind us that it's timeless.
Yeah.
And I really love that because it's almost like reading one of your tomes 3D-izes it. It brings it into our reality and it makes it tangible, and it attaches the actual ritualistic meaning as opposed to kind of a sterile academic examination of this. And I think, Peter, this leads exactly to a word that you've mentioned several times now, which is initiation. And you mention in this latest tome, in Ritual and Epiphany in the Mysteries of Mithras,
Yeah.
can you share with us what are comparative ethnographies of initiation, and how did you draw on comparative ethnographies of initiation? Why is that so important?
I mean, evidence like the frescoes of the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii clearly delineate a very kind of expansive initiatory process. You see steps of preparation. You see, actually, what you see in mystery cult iconography generally is a mixture of metaphysics, process, and psychophysical outcome. And the reason the iconography needs to record that is that the mystery cults are what we would call far over on the spectrum of religiosities towards what's called imagistic. If you can think of this spectrum of religiosities spanning from imagistic to doctrinal, and we all know what doctrinal is. It's how most conventional state religions and churches work. But the mystery cults are as far away from that as you can get, because they deal in a personal, direct, embodied experience of the divine. Okay, that the whole apparatus is designed to deliver that experience, and the experience is essentially unspeakable, ineffable in its essence. So, while this is the great strength of imagistic or mystery traditions, the great weakness, of course, is they don't have that accompanying system and documentation. So the loss of key members can disrupt the apparatus. It can cease to work, So what they have tended to do is concentrate in their iconography, and let's face it, most of the world was illiterate until fairly recently. Levels of literacy in the Roman Empire were about 5%. So iconography is everything, actually. It's visual language. But in a mystery cult, it has this additional burden of actually carrying the tradition forward. So the iconography was never meant to be seen by anyone but the initiates. Yeah, and it's important to remind ourselves of that, because you can just visit the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii and gaze at the sacred iconography there, or any of the Mithraea in Europe. But you know, you're looking at something which is, its context was more than just artwork. In an essentially animist worldview, that iconography is a living iconography. Okay, in as much as the ritual process is kind of founded upon ritual acts in mythology of the deity. Okay, the iconography similarly is imbued from this animist perspective with the energy of the deity. And therefore the iconography is an extension of the deity itself. It's an active participant in the ritual process. And this sensibility is by and large lost in modernity. It's kind of alien to us now. But to understand the significance of the iconography, it's essential to to look at it through the eyes of the people who actually fashioned it and used it. So it was, and this is important for me because as I analyzed Mithraic iconography, I understood that it embodied the psychophysical realization of the initiation process itself, if you can just identify it within the iconography. This is going to be a major theme at the forthcoming Occulture Festival in Berlin, which is next week. We'll probably talk about this later, but in context, what I've done is essentially re-examined the core of Mithraic iconography and identified those parts of it that actually depict the state of realization consequent upon the initiation. And so, that then allows me to look at the ritual process and ask the question, okay, if that's the goal, so to speak, what did they need to do to bring the initiate to that point? And so I've used a whole series of like field studies, Vermaserin's original field notes, the surviving frescoes. And then I used generative AI to recreate the ritual process of initiation into the mysteries of Mithras. So that now exists in very high definition imagery, full initiatory sequence. And maybe sometime I should come on your show and we'll go through it if you want. It's highly visual material. I'll present it for the first time at Occulture in Berlin. And thereafter, I'm quite open to presenting it if it's of interest to your members.
Absolutely, Peter. That would be so wonderful. And I love that you're literally going back to original sources, original documents, going back in this subjective time, but then also using future quote unquote or the latest technology as well to recreate some of these images.
I mean, we all have this kind of undecided feelings about generative AI. It raises a lot of questions for all of us. But I think in this field of archaeological recovery, it's done so, they have all these burnt scrolls from the library of a very wealthy villa in Herculaneum. And they're just charred. I mean, they're totally burned scrolls. And who knows what philosophical and literary texts are there. But with AI, they've managed to start reading them and reconstructing the text without breaking the scroll up, because it'll just dissolve into dust if you attempt to manually manipulate it. But and they have a similar program running on cuneiform, because they have thousands and thousands of tablets. And the difficulty of translating cuneiform, I mean, it really is a specialist area. So there's just not enough specialists to cope with the volume of tablets that they have, which they've excavated. But scanning them and running them through AI is now rendering a fair translation of these texts. So there's kind of, a treasure trove of the past that has been lost to us because of generative AI. We're now finding a way to actually access it. And it's really exciting. I can't imagine what kind of lost classical texts are going to appear out of this library at Herculaneum. Of course, so many texts were burnt or destroyed or lost over the millennia, so this is really an exciting development, whereas many of the other developments are not so exciting and not so not something to look forward to. Anyway, this is by the by.
Oh, this is lovely. I completely agree with you, by the way. I certainly am guilty, as I'm sure many others, of, oh, look at this cool image. AI can I always appreciate exactly human artists, human creators, all of that.
Yeah.
But when it comes to putting those pieces together, I was trying to find my learn beginner's Sumerian, and it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. I thought I thought Arabic verb, conjugations
Yeah.
are bad. No,
Yeah.
there's nothing
No.
beats the Sumerian verbal chain. It's wild. So I absolutely love that. And to your
There
point,
can't be more than a handful of
oh,
experts capable of really reading these texts.
right, exactly. I was thinking of previous guests on the show. Dr. Irving Finkel at the British Museum is certainly
Yeah.
one of them, one of the
Yeah,
legends.
one of them.
But it's got to be so small to be able to actually
And the
go.
volume of text is absolutely enormous.
Oh yeah,
It's so preserved with the heat and everything. It's clay.
yeah,
They actually, the opposite of the parchments, and
yeah,
he's actually baked them,
yeah.
preserved them perfectly. Anyway.
Right, right. And to your exact point, Peter, I have a bunch. Chatting with you, I always have notes. So you have this.
Okay.
You have this imagistic versus doctrinal, kind of
Yeah.
contrast. The imagistic, some of the things you just mentioned, it's the visual language, but it's also an extension of the deity, especially in a mostly illiterate culture where most people couldn't, but they could immediately understand the symbolism and the imagistic use of the living ritual. And I'm looking forward to talking about that in just a bit, but maybe we could just temporarily broaden the circumference, Peter, for someone who might be hearing about this for the first time. And again, listeners, check the links below to get your own copy of Peter's book. But Peter, who is the figure of Mithras? Like, when we talk about the image, which is just an easy question, right? A very quick answer. But can you tell us about who, broadly speaking, is Mithras in terms of this particular cult, especially if someone's hearing about this for the first time? Before we get into the imagistic frescoes and everything else,
sure.
who is this amazing figure?
Well, the first thing to understand is that the name Mitra is attested in the Sanskrit, in the Indian subcontinent, therefore in the Vedas. He's attested in the Avesta, which is the pre-Zoroastrian. We're talking Bronze Age, basically, and he's attested in a Hittite Mitanni peace treaty from about 1400 BCE, so Bronze Age Anatolia. Now, the fact that this deity, as a figure overseeing all contracts and agreements, and therefore very appropriate figure for the ruling caste, so to speak, who are responsible for that. The fact that he appears over such a vast geographic area simultaneously means that he was in the Proto-Indo-European language family. Okay. So, if you ever look at the Indo-European family tree, the occurrence of certain names common to a vast range of these independent families of languages means that it's almost certainly Proto-Indo-European. Where you place the origin of Proto-Indo-European, however, is really a very, difficult question to answer. It's complicated, but we're talking now about the Neolithic. So a deity typical of ruling elites who command contracts and agreements, oversees them, and only really comes into focus in the Hellenistic age in Anatolia. Okay, now here's another aspect of it. The most significant image that people tend to associate with the cult of Mithras is the so-called Tauroctony, or bull killing scene. Okay, in which Mithras, like kneeling on the back of the bull, holds its nose, he stabs it in the shoulder, and one of his legs, his foot, traps the rear hoof of the bull. It's very distinctive image. It's not one that naturally comes to mind. Okay, where's the first occurrence of this image? I found it in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the episode called The Bull of Heaven, Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the Bull of Heaven that's sent to destroy the planet. Okay, and specifically they mention trapping the hoof with a foot. Now that action occurs again in the frescoes in the Capua Vetere Mithraea of the 2nd century CE. And one of the initiatory stages, the initiator stands on the foot of the initiatee. Now, it's important to see this because we're talking about an enormous elasticity. I mean, if this passage occurs in the Epic of Gilgamesh around 2000 BCE, it was almost certainly part of an oral tradition long before it was written down. So how far back exactly, it's kind of... So most people engage with the cult of Mithras in its Roman recension. And that's where it really achieves a high degree of visibility because of the archaeology that's being conducted since like the 15th, 16th century. Antiquarianism, let's say, became archaeology eventually. But they were digging up this stuff in late 15th, early and 16th century. And of course, that created a collector's market for these items, for these statues. And that's how most of them ended up in the great museums of the world. So a conception of what the cult of Mithras actually was didn't exist before the late 19th century. Okay. So really, from when it disappeared around, 500 CE, maybe, probably 600 CE at the latest. For 1,000 years, or over 1,000 years, it's almost completely invisible. And then scholars, through the antiquarian trade, start asking the basic questions. What on earth was this cult about? And especially the quality of some of the statues is absolutely incredible. So it was clearly, and at least in Rome, it was an elite cult. These are incredibly large, expensive marble statues, engineered to the highest standards, and you'll see them in the great museums in Paris, Rome, London, and I'm sure in New York as well. So that really stirred scholars up into trying to interrogate this aspect of Roman society and culture, which I don't believe even today they've successfully grappled with. Because the very notion of a cult based on a direct manifestation of the deity to its members is simply one step too far for academia to acknowledge.
Yes.
But that's the reality, that's what, in fact, it shouldn't come as a surprise, because possession cults are by far the oldest and most enduring form of human, what do we call it, religio-spiritual evolution that we have. There's like 99.5% of human cultures manifest possession cults. And, from the iconography of the Upper Paleolithic caves, it just looks like that's what they're often depicting. So we're talking about a real cornerstone of the human spiritual evolution here. And yet nobody has addressed it as such. Our spiritual evolution is predicated on the practice of voluntary possession by a deity. This is an extraordinary idea. And then everything else flows on from that, the healing, the magic, and so on and so forth. But
Fascinating.
without possession, you don't have the raw, you don't have the fuel in the tank, so to speak. It's where the rubber meets the road. Voluntary possession. Involuntary possession, of course, is another thing. We're not going to get into that today, I guess. So
Right. Even though it is the spooky season, we will leave exorcistic procedures to another episode. But Peter, you're right. This is one of the major themes of your work, and we'll certainly get in. It really is a connecting thread, all the way from Game of Saturn to your latest work. And so, and you are helpfully in your tome and in this conversation decrypting or unshrouding to a degree the mystery, kind of giving us a peek behind the veil. And I think you mentioned obviously voluntary possession as one of the goals, but here are two broad questions in terms of what we do know and that you document in the book. What is, as you say, if you can elaborate a little bit more about what is the key ritual mechanic to achieve that goal, and what do we know about the hierarchical, kind of Roman imperialistic hierarchical structure of this cult in the Roman reception? Can you tell us about the goal and the hierarchy?
Okay, so this may seem a little strange, but we need to have a conception of what a deity is. If we're going to talk about possession by a divinity or a deity, how do we conceive that? And the way in which I think about it these days is that the universe has a trajectory, a kind of spiritually unfolding trajectory, and that the vectors of this spiritual unfolding are what we call gods. Okay. So this is way beyond any particular physical representation of deity. This is well beyond it. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the universe has a teleological, it's a goal-directed unfolding towards a higher order of spiritual consciousness, and that the vectors of this are deity. So that a mystery cult, in essence, requires that you align yourself with an evolutionary force. And the way you align yourself is through devotion and action. The extent to which you take on the deity's purpose in the universe as your own purpose and manifest it in your own sphere automatically aligns you with a god. So the positive community-based activity is essential, an essential element of this. And we're talking not about we're talking about action that lends itself to the spiritual unfolding of yourself and others in your circle. Okay, and to the extent that you achieve that, you are already aligned with a deity, although you may not notice it. So, in essence, what the mystery cult adds to that is the psychophysical realization of that connection. It makes it so intense as to be unmistakable. But it can only be it can come to you individually just because you're so attuned to it. But typically it would come to you because a devotee is so attuned to it that their atmosphere is contagious. so that they initiate by your being in their presence. Okay. And then there's versions of that process where there's a psychophysical transfer of energy. And that's of course what most of us experience with a Sui Reiki. Oh, we have this like initiatory ritual we place hands on, but it's not my energy. I'm just making myself available. I'm cutting that time out of my life to do that, really, So this is the mechanism, stripped bare. So aligning that with the Roman elite is difficult because our image of the Roman elite is so negative because of people like, all the stories told of people like Nero, Caligula, and all the others, okay? And of course, because of the brutality of the times. I mean, Rome was an expansionist empire. But as we saw in the Villa of the Mysteries, the Roman elite also were Orphic devotees. Amongst this elite were people who were totally dedicated to the initiatory path. So, we need to like balance our perception of elites generally and recognize that, amongst them are members who are genuinely spiritually inspired, who inspire others, and who fulfill a spiritual and evolutionary purpose. And so we have to have a slightly more nuanced perception of Roman elites, let's say, or of elites in this day and age, even perhaps, which is difficult to do. But anyway, okay.
100%. No, this is I completely agree. And as difficult as it is to do, it's excellent that you are giving us this historical context. So tell me if this is somewhat approaching the ballpark. Is in this imperialistic Roman reception of the Mithraic mysteries,
Yeah.
You had a positive community-based initiatory activity where in this Mithraic Roman hierarchical structure, you had some kind of leader, some kind of person who is guiding the communal-based initiatory self-possession, and they're inviting other members, other initiates,
Yeah.
to receive the deity. Is
Yeah.
is the goal of this? Is it complete like theurgistic union with the god? Is it self-possession in the sense of, as you said with healing, that now that circuit has been connected, you can avail yourself, make yourself available for communal healing, communal efforts to help others? What is the ultimate goal of this invitation of self-possession in the Mithraic rite?
I think they had a number of like it's like a layer cake, actually. The initiatory processes, we'll talk about this later, but they were kind of the exception to normal community activity within the Mithraea. Okay. Their core activity was the banquet, a sacred banquet, which has nothing to do with Greek or Roman banqueting practices. Okay. Nothing to do with it. It's quiet devotional meal shared with the deity so that they would be imbued with that energy on an ongoing basis. And they were a secret cult, so their visibility in the public sphere would have been minimal, in my judgment. In the public sphere, they went about their jobs, whatever they were. And once this cult was, so to speak, dispersed from Rome on the back of appointments to the provinces, to the legions, it's in essence a community of people with high moral principles, high sense of community, and a high degree of service. So they would conduct themselves in that way, whatever their jobs were in the outer world. But it remained a secret mystery cult. And this is true of all the mystery cults of antiquity, actually. They were, they have this devotional element at their core, which is not readily shareable to other people. I think to okay, there's three ways in which these in which the mysteries were manifest in the ancient world. One is sanctuary-based mystery cults like Eleusis, Samothrace. There you had like a permanent priesthood. They carried the initiatory lineage over centuries, and people just came to them, underwent the ritual, had that sense of enlightenment, and left. And you could repeat it as many times as you want. And then you had like the itinerant initiators. And this is typically in the cult of Dionysus. Okay. So they would be hired or would go village to village, and they would be doing initiations and healing initiations and attunements and, a far more like magically imbued service on a town by town, village to village basis. So they'd be expected to help with any kind of spiritual problems encountered in the community. Okay. Hauntings, whatever came up essentially, but they would also do initiations. And then you have Mithraism, which is a small community-based organization. So it doesn't fit into the other categories. They had like a fixed cadre. And the reason they had that is because they were paying for it out of their own pocket. Okay, so to build the Mithraea and to furnish it, and then to have these regular meetings where you have a banquet, and they ate very modestly, by the way. This was not like a roasted bull in the middle of, these are exceptionally small spaces of maybe 10 to 20 people. Many of them would have been relatives, because when you're posted from Rome to a province or a legion, you don't go alone. You need to go with trusted advisors who were probably close relatives, military advisor, legal advisor, political officer, this kind of, so you'd have a core of people, and they would probably, you'd establish your Mithraea with those people almost certainly, and then you'd recruit in any extra number that you felt you could afford to maintain. And that would include freedmen, slaves. I mean, it was not discriminatory because of the nature of the cult. But you'd end up with a fairly fixed number, and then you'd only conduct initiations if you've lost members, like in a pretty bad battle or in play, something like this. You'd lose members. You'd run the initiation processes again to make up the body that you can afford to maintain. It was all privately funded, administered. And so it meant that whoever founded the cult had to have that initiatory lineage. So they had to be capable of conveying that to the rest, so to speak. And this brings clarification to the so-called 7 steps, 7 grade structure. Okay, because you need a top end of that grade structure as officers running and administering the cult. So it's not as though everyone goes through all 7 stages and you end up with 30 like Mithraic paters. It's also the idea of going through 7 stages is kind of unhistorical. I mean, the Hellenistic mystery cults only acknowledged 2 essential rituals. One was myasis, purification, and the second was the initiation itself. So the whole promise of a mystery cult is that with that initiation, you went directly through all the planetary spheres to the realm of the demiurge, and you encountered the divinity there. When you think of it as a metaphor. Therefore, it doesn't make sense to get initiated to each planet on the way, because the whole point of the cult was to go straight there. That's what the mystery cults promised and delivered. Direct, personal, embodied experience of the divinity itself, the deity itself. And, these cults were always the cult of a specific deity. Okay. So, that devotional element to a specific deity. And a deity in that sense is the form in which the evolutionary energy of the universe is being manifested. Okay.
And with that, Peter, too, when it comes to this initiation of an invitation, this stepping into receiving the divinity with that grade structure,
Yeah.
and for communal, as you say, this kind of small, community based, maybe 10 to 20 people, how is this self-possession related to the self-possession that you describe in your previous work? So for example, the dark Saturnine, Moloch Leviathan based, encryption in the Solabusca, the 1470s, 1480s Solabusca deck.
Yeah.
Is that like the dark chthonic side of the other coin with this, or can you share with us how do you
Yeah.
think about that, this self-possession of the Mithraic mysteries versus, say, other forms of that?
But of course, the Solabusca book was written almost 10 years ago. That's when I was doing the research.
Right.
So what that has caused me to do is to reflect on the way in which we conceptualize more broadly the spiritual life. And what I recognized was that the Christian moral dualism has really affected the way in which we judge cults and rituals and religions. So the polarity of good and evil, for instance, was not recognized in the Hellenistic world. Okay. So ethical dualism for me became very problematic. And when I drop it, everything falls into its natural place. So so-called Gnostic dualism then is kind of, I don't know, in my perceptions, kind of an illness of contemporary society. There is evil, but it's always evil done by generally a person. It doesn't exist as an abstract entity. And my 20, 30 years of healing experience convinced me that there are extremely powerful entities out there, but they're parasitic. I mean, a tiger is not evil, but it, can do some damn evil things if it's let loose in the middle of town. But it's a relative evil. It's just the nature of the beast as a carnivore and a hunter. And similarly, on the subtle planes, there are entities which are parasitic. They're not innately evil as such. They may be threatening, but then any sentient or center of sentient awareness that feels threatened will become threatening in turn. And so our presence on the subtle planes needs to be modulated. So, for instance, ghost hunting is an intrusive and unempathetic activity, just is. You're dealing with people who have become trapped in a kind of continuous now. And that now has largely disappeared. It doesn't exist anymore, but they're still running the routines as though it existed. They're lost. So your presence amongst them is incredibly disturbing, disorientating, and naturally would lead to them becoming like threatening almost. Because the level of existential anxiety that your presence is giving rise to is probably the mirror image of the level of anxiety most of us would feel in the presence of a ghost. So yeah, what I'm trying to say, therefore, is that the notion of absolute metaphysical good and evil is illusory, and it's a falsification. And therefore, we need to reconsider all the so-called dark elements and what darkness actually means. And what I see it as meaning is that there's a phase in which we need to confront the loss of the persona. And that is experienced as a death-like experience when it's really intense, you know. So certain movements of Kundalini, for instance, are often preceded by a plunge into a sense of annihilation. And that's not evil, but it's like an extinction event. And then the energy rises and it becomes blissful. Okay, so there's a psychophysical basis, in other words, for all of the dark imagery. And there's, of course, a pathway for those who want to explore it, who want to attract parasitic entities to themselves because they believe they can make a contract with them to perform certain acts. Okay, there's certainly a pathway like that, as long as those people acknowledge they're not going to get rid of them upon death. They're going to stay with them. I've treated cases where people they couldn't understand why these entities were haunting them in this life. Violently so, by the way. And it made no sense to their current conscious awareness, but the entity had a distinct sense of possession, of having a contract, and it was not going to give up on it. There was some benefit or advantage to having this connection with somebody who is now manifested in the physical plane. In other words, it gave the entity operability in a way in which it couldn't otherwise achieve.
It's almost like you have this parasitic sense versus the conscious invitation of possession of the deity, as opposed to a parasitic entity in the Mithraic sense as well.
Yeah. So the characteristic of possession by a deity is that you briefly share a deity's awareness. Okay. And that is ecstatic and expansive beyond our ability to express. Where it occurs in the cult of Mithras is in a fairly rare relief that you can see of Mithras emerging into the presence of Kronos. And the tradition, the Hellenistic tradition, is that this is the sleep of Kronos. He's sleeping in the golden age. Now, so we're like going around the houses now in a kind of poetic sense to try and give a feeling for what the psychophysical state is. Sleeping Kronos is compared or contrasted with the waking Kronos, who as a titan is possessed by these extraordinary passions. This is how it would be expressed poetically. And when he sleeps, he comes into his divine element of absolute harmony. And so Mithras is shown emerging into the presence of the sleeping Kronos in the golden age. And what they're trying to describe there is the psychophysical complement of non-dual awareness. Henosis with the deity enables non-dual awareness to emerge within our own consciousness, within our own sphere. Although it's borrowed, we can't sustain it. As soon as the deity departs, crash back into our physical reality. But for a brief period, having that taste of non-dual awareness through the gift of the deity, and it is a gift, entirely revolutionizes our conception of life and death and of the universe and everything. Because all of a sudden we're part of that larger teleological spiritual unfolding. And we know ourselves to be a part of it. It's not an intellectual proposition. It's now psychophysically manifested in our own being, however momentarily. It changes everything.
That's fascinating. So, this is a very clumsy way to put it, but so when we talk about the ritual grammar of the Mithraic iconography,
Yeah.
I'd love for you to share exactly, and listeners, check the links below so you can actually appreciate the full context. But Peter, would it be fair to say then that so if sleeping Kronos and Mithras emerging in the presence of sleeping Kronos, that's that divine element, that deity, that temporary where you briefly share in the deity's awareness. Whereas, would it be fair to say, whereas waking Kronos, those kind of Titan possessed by passions, would be if you're not engaging directly with the deity. So perhaps, you're ascending the seven heavens, or you are engaging with a parasitic entity. In other words, there's some kind of temporal, passionistic engagement, which is the opposite of the sleeping Cronus. Would that be somewhat in the ballpark?
Yeah, that's our normal state.
We're all waking Kronos. Okay.
We're all like chasing,
Yeah.
pretty illusory goals most of the time.
Yeah.
We want to be fitter, we want to be more beautiful, we want to have more partners, we want to have more money, we want to have more. The list is endless, They are the Titanic passions. They're all distractions, essentially, given this God view. But, that's where we are. We have to accept it. That's where we start.
This is fascinating. And Peter, is central to your research and to your book. So many listeners I know are familiar with, given, the grimoires and the Renaissance and the late medieval period, Thomistic metaphysics, which is really Aristotelian metaphysics with a Catholic veneer, gilded Catholic veneer on it. But you tell us about Orphic metaphysics, because what role did Orphic metaphysics play in the kinetics of the Roman imperialistic reception of the Mithraic mysteries? What are, broadly speaking, Orphic metaphysics? How does this all intertwine for you?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, everything I've said was in the context of Orphic metaphysics up to now. But, you can isolate it into like 4 or 5 key points. One is the eternal life of the soul. That's the first thing. This sense that we're participating in a much larger game. Along with that comes metapsychosis of living and having lived many lives. Thirdly, the providential outreach of the deity. That's to say, all the gods, all the time, are reaching out to all of us. Okay. And the efficacy of theurgic and mystery rites for achieving henosis. So these are like 4 key points to orientate yourself towards Orphism. But there's another key point, that having achieved henosis, the point is not to, so to speak, bathe in the bliss. The point is what you do with it. So having, so to speak, cleansed the familial and ancestral and biographical, and by that, what we mean is you've restored and rebuilt your energy body to be a suitable vehicle for intermediation on multiple dimensions of being, including with deities, but with other spirits as well. Okay. To then get about and do whatever job it was that you signed up for when you took the present incarnation. So that's like the complete Orphic catalog, metaphysical view. I don't know how to describe it, but that's Orphism in essence, in my view.
That's amazing. So the successful reception of the deity, as you say, that kind of, Kundalini-esque bliss and that ecstasy, that's like standing in the waterfall, but you say it's not enough it's what you do with it. So you can stand in the waterfall, the initial reception, but then it's how do you channel that flow of that divine essence, or make yourself available for it to flow?
Yeah.
Okay.
I say the larger game is the teleological unfolding of the universe. We may be ants, but
Right.
we're still part of it.
Right.
Enough ants put their shoulder to something, they generally achieve it.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
So all we need to do is do our own bit.
Mhm.
Yeah. And in a sense, the spiritual path, at least initially, is that discovery process. What is our part in this larger vision? What do we need to let go of to allow ourselves to do that? And that's normally the biggest step most of us have to take at some point. What do I stop indulging in? What do I give up, or what do I need to give up to make that spiritual life concrete so that it occupies every day, 7 days a week? So you need to work towards that, I would say. That's in my experience. Doesn't generally all happen in one go. So you take steps and realizations occur, and you realize you don't need this, whatever it was, so much, and not needing that frees up energy for more important things. And slowly you bring yourself to full realization of your spiritual potential in this life.
Mm. It's incredibly powerful and very holistic and challenging. You're right, for so many of us with the egoic based approach to life.
Yes,
to
that's the Titanic life.
Right. Waking Chronos. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Peter, you also, your research, in addition to positively haunting me, it also inspires a lot of questions from listeners as well. And
Yeah. Okay.
we do have a few from Glitch Bottle patrons, and we have one of them from Elijah Ochoa, who is saying, it's kind of an all-encompassing question, so feel free to, take it whatever direction you'd like. Elijah says, one of the most basic components of ritual involves the way by which we spend our time, exactly as you were saying just now, Peter.
Yeah.
As what we receive from evocations, invocations, gestures, postures, the applied art itself is according to every element of the ritual that we practice. So Elijah's saying, I'm wondering how these rituals, as you're learning of them, gave back to its practitioners a conception of time, or perhaps as well the way in which they would orient themselves according to their environment. What did these individuals see to the world that we all experience, especially of its earlier, more raw practitioners or perhaps rituals? The importance here couldn't be more essential, Elijah says. Although it may be highly disputed, we know this is a tradition that even Constantine the Great would practice, including some Roman officers under churches and outside of civilization's sight. But Elijah says, I wonder how much in what they gained still drives itself as some of our main ideas and thoughts today. A tradition that surely deserves its sanctuary weight to the modern world we experience today. So Elijah says, thank you, Peter. Your work on the healing field is an essential key to any wandering magician. And I completely agree. But yeah, so what do you think about that in terms of Elijah's question about the conception of time and how it influences us today?
There's a short and a long answer. The short answer is read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations. Okay. I'm sure we have a copy somewhere.
Yep. I know it's here.
If you could only find, somewhere here.
So
yeah, that's the short answer.
Mm-hmm.
He answers most of these questions in a very methodical way. That's the great beauty of that text. Time and temporality are fundamental. I would say we can recognize 5 fundamental ways in which we experience chronos, time. And each one of them, in a sense, is a spiritual discipline. Okay, so there's chronological time. And then we can think about chronological time in terms of the quality of our presence in the world. So, there's like wasted time. There's time of leisure, and there's time absorbed, that's to say reflective time. So just being aware of how you're using chronological time is like foundational. And chronological time is the single most important resource that you possess, because it's finite and it cannot be recovered. Okay. So the second form of time is chirological. And that's the decision moment when you're confronted with needing to react, to take action. It requires choice and deliberation, recognizing the chirological moment of decision. And then, instead of acting impulsively, being aware of your action. I would say that is another discipline. And therefore, that is why Marcus Aurelius is so important. He say, start the day deciding what you're going to accomplish. End the day by looking at what you actually did accomplish. you know. So those decisions by which you direct yourself to different activities need to take place in this larger framework. What am I trying to achieve? Okay, so chronological time, chirological time are kind of complementary to each other. You can only achieve things chirologically, because chronological time doesn't exist, at least in our awareness of it. It's only memory, fallible memory. The other form of time is synchronistic time. And this is where the path of your individualization, which is to say that process from birth through to wherever you are now, during which the persona is formed and matures, the path of individualization crosses the path of individuation, which is impersonal. Okay. Synchronicities are exactly that. Recognizing them and trying to understand why they occurred, both positive and negative synchronicities, by the way. Both occur. Most of our relationships are synchronistic. At work, in personal relationships, and it's very uncomfortable to reflect on why it is that they have the quality they do. In many cases, the quality is not what we would want them to be. And so we're kind of confronted with the limitations of the persona and why it is that this set of, circumstances are like showered down on us. So where are we? 1, 2, 3. Fourth kind of time is aeonic time. And that's the ever recurrent time of ritually mediated myth, or rituals mediated by mythology. So essentially, whenever you undertake a ritual which is founded upon the mythic action of a deity, you are in essence collapsing time within the space of the rite. Okay. And that gives access to the kind of energy that the deity manifests. So for Dionysus, it's one. For Persephone, it's another. For Demeter, still another. Mars is a different energy, But essentially, the ritual process based on the mythic action is a collapse of chronological space and time in favor of mythic or aeonic time, which gives you different vectors of activity or upon which you can express yourself or impose yourself. Okay. So it would tend to be transpersonal, multidimensional space of ritual. So it just depends on the ritual design, of course, what you're attempting to achieve. But clearly, freeing yourself of your normal awareness of chronological time is a prerequisite for the efficacy of that to take place. That collapse will take place as part of energy, but raising energy requires that we stop, looking at our watches, for instance. Or, maybe there's something else on the TV, I must get this done by the next 10 minutes so I don't miss the program on TV. That is not a mindset conducive.
Yes, so it certainly gives a lot of new meaning to the word time suck, right? That's exactly what it is. Um,
And
that's
finally,
fascinating. Yeah.
fifth one is chronic time. That's the perfected time of the golden age, arising in states of non-dual awareness and as a gift of a deity.
Mm. Yeah. So that's
So you can say the Saturnian path, at least in my mind, is a disciplinary path in relation to time.
so even though, as you say, the reception of the deity itself, the deity, that is, of course, a timeless aspect. It is actually, paradoxically, but makes total sense, the initiate able to effectively understand, surf the flow of time, understand the different ways that chronology and time and deity weave together in the individual's life, and then how that
Yeah.
aperture is opened up into the communal healing or communal aspects of you allowing that current to flow through you
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
time.
very much so. Yeah, very much so. I mean, whatever you do has to take place in chronologically, so to speak, even though that's kind of illusory. You only have moments. But still, chronology is the way in which we structure time and space. So, so when we move into these other modalities of awareness of time, we're actually changing the time space around us. You know,
Is this, Peter, related to something that you touch on? I know in many of your previous tomes as well, which is you, and especially documenting. Oh gosh, I'm going back in time here in my head. But
Yeah.
I think Victorian era anthropologists, but that you have objectivity and then you have subjectivity, but then you have intersubjectivity. You have this entire verdant field of potentiality that
Yeah.
participants can communally experience the same. Is that kind of part of one of those key elements of the Mithraic mysteries itself is an invitation of intersubjectivity in this invitation to be temporarily possessed by the deity. I don't know if that made any sense, but please let me know if that makes
Yeah, I mean,
sense.
the space of the rite, the ritual space, is ideally interdimensional and intersubjective. So, for instance, it's transpersonal is another way of saying it, rather than intersubjective. It's transpersonal. So that within the ritual space, everyone will experience more or less the same thing, even though to an external observer, there's nothing taking place except the ritualists are standing there. Okay. But for the ritualists, they are interacting with a whole series of entities, beings, deities. And Proclus is one of the very few who has described the ritual space. He says, before the gods come, all manner of chthonic entities and demons flow through the ritual space and scare the life out of the initiates. He says, but they can just hold themselves together long enough. The deity shows up, and everything changes. You can acknowledge and worship a deity from close at hand, which is a very common description for those who attend the higher yoga tantra initiations of the Indo-Tibetan tradition. You actually see the deity. The mandala is a plan of a palace. Okay, so as the initiation starts, you in imaginally and then psychically you enter the palace, and you ascend the layers of the palace, and at the top you'll find the deity. There's what more can I say?
No, I think that really does hit one of the key things that you've challenged. I know you've shattered my preconceptions and my misconceptions about Saturn and about time, and really challenging to do away with that kind of, and I think you're right, deeply ingrained in so many of us, this kind of dualistic scaffolding that we put as effectively a neutering architecture on our potential to have an interaction in these rites. And I think, Peter, this goes to exactly another listener question that we have for you from Joseph, aka the Hermetic Druid. And Joseph is asking and saying, hello, my question is, how do we square, pun intended, Saturn as the goodly king who presided over a golden age? How do we square that with the image of Saturn, of the Saturn of Hermeticism, as the great malefic? And I think, tell me because earlier you were saying, Peter, I think this goes to what you were saying about shattering those misconceptions, about not having this dualistic perception. Can you elaborate on that to Joseph's question?
Yeah, I mean, from what, 6th, 7th century onwards until fairly recently, ethical dualism dominated our awareness. As you say, it was the scaffolding of our conceptual world. And when you dispense with it, I think you would have a purer and truer Hermeticism. Because at the end of the day, I mean, let's consider it in an alchemical perspective. It's the transformation of the psychophysical being that's essential. And the Nigredo is an absolutely essential, you could even say it is the most critical stage of the alchemical opus. Because it's only there that the real work demolishing the persona takes place. So characterizing it as saturnine, as dark, and is quite appropriate. It is. Anyone who's undergone that process in any degree of intensity will say, yes, it was horrible. Just is horrible. But it is the most fruitful one, because without it, you can't reconstruct reality. You can't reconstruct your being in the world into a far more positive place. And one of the things I can add there is that because of the tools and techniques we now have for energy healing, it's easy to cleanse the energy body of blockages, right? You can self-manage this. You can find people who can help you manage it. The elimination of those blockages allows the energy to flow more freely. And we talked earlier about, the rites necessary to, so to speak, knit together and strengthen the energy body are everything in this process. I mean, all the books that you and I have don't actually repair the energy body themselves. Ideally, they would direct us towards doing so. But it's a job to actually then repair all the traumas of childhood, familial and ancestral karma. And by doing so, you you create the potentialities, which are absolutely central to the entire spiritual path. Without the subtle body, you cannot engage effectively on different dimensions and planes of existence. So it doesn't have to be traumatic, is what I'm trying to say. The tools and techniques we have now, you can rapidly free yourself from most of the mental, emotional afflictions that most of us have carried at different times of our life. You don't have to carry them around with you. That is one of the huge benefits of the last 30, 40 years. The range of energy psychology techniques and their effectiveness is absolutely phenomenal. And so this like dark night of the soul thing, which was like, in the Romantic age, Kierkegaard, all the Romantic poets, was kind of an overwhelming darkness, is easily cleared these days.
Peter, this goes directly to your point about research. I'm curious, what was one of the most surprising things that you found while you were researching and putting this latest tome together? Because as you say, your research into Saturn and the Mithraic mysteries and the cults of initiation, going back all the way, many years ago, as you mentioned with your Game of Saturn research. So
Yeah.
what was the biggest thing? Was it the touch points between your and Kenzie's healing practices and modern techniques connecting back? Was it breaking more of that Gnostic dualism? What were some of the big surprises that you had in the years since Game of Saturn all the way until now with your latest research that you personally found with
I
this
think
book?
well, I think one of the biggest realizations came that the Kundalini is a real force and that its transformative potential is vast. Okay, so that realization all of a sudden broke all of the kind of conceptual frameworks. Here was a psychophysical event which is attainable to some level and which totally changes the game. So question is, learn about it, find out what is a safe way to operate with this. And one of the safe ways we found was a Sui Reiki, to initiate others to use the energy on a daily basis, to never be separate from that energy and use it for everything. So, it's a small step, but it's a step in the right direction. Okay. So rather than all the study, all the research, it's actually the energy work itself is that's the foundation stone. And the realization that it is the transformative element, because it's not your Kundalini. It's also a cosmic force, and in the Orphic cosmogenesis, Heracles Kronos is a dragon form. Dionysus has a dragon form. The most fun, when we're talking about Kundalini, we're talking about the deities themselves, the power of the deities themselves, and the big deities. These are big spirits. So the Dionysian form of the energy, the Cronian form of the energy, it's all the same draconian current, in essence. And that realization brought it close to me. It's not some distant thing. I'm not looking for some initiators in the Tibetan mountains anymore. The hidden masters, all of this stuff, which we can exhaust ourselves reading about. Okay, it's so close to home. So we need to just recognize what are the obstacles to our personal realization of it. Okay, and then get to work, clear those. Use the energy techniques that are available. Develop yourself. I mean, I've done all kinds of. I did the family constellation therapy, EFT, Reiki, you name it. And more than anything else, work with people to help them, because that all of a sudden changes your awareness. Energy plus service relativizes the persona faster than anything can do. And when you kind of, the persona is like shrunk because of this larger perspective that you now inhabit, it's just far less of an irritant.
I
Just
will.
is, just all of a sudden, and because you're serving a higher purpose, all of a sudden, a lot of stuff that was so important beforehand just isn't anymore. So this is a path that anyone can set out on, but it requires action.
I love that. All condensed into a lovely, I mean, that energy plus service equals the relativizing of the persona faster
Yeah,
and more efficiently than many, many other things
yeah,
could.
and also it aligns you with a deity immediately.
Mhm.
You may not realize it for decades, but actually you join that larger flow of serving and evolving and spiraling evolution of the universe, which we are part of.
Love that. In fact, a subtitle for this chat could be a phrase you use, which I love, which is collapsing time. That's really what it's about, is the
Yeah,
non-locality, the non-temporality of it, but yet it's still allowing that flow in temporality to help others
yeah.
is
So
incredible.
you collapse the illusion of time, essentially. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, Peter, I certainly definitely want to ask you, because you are always working on something. I definitely want to talk about kind of forward thinking, some other projects that you're working on. But before that, you know, as we wrap up kind of the main thrust of the podcast, there are many elements that you touched on. I just want to leave an open floor in terms of key things that you want people to remember as they check out the links below and get their own copy of your book. But there were so many things that you mentioned that you wanted to touch on. The communal meal, for example, being one of the central tenets of the actual
Yeah.
cult itself, but also, what are some of the big key takeaways that you want listeners to remember as they embark on this Saturnine path, if you will?
Well, I think I've said it all. I mean, there's not much I can add to that. Um, the point is that as long as you only read books, the path always seems either too excitingly close or too remote. So you tend to oscillate between two extremes, overexcitement and then kind of depression with it. Where is it? I can't find it, kind of thing. I can't find guidance, for instance. That's typical complaint that people may have. But it's only by overcoming the inertia of doing something that you can break that vicious cycle. But the minute you start to take action, that's exactly what you do. You start to break that cycle. So for me, it was the healing work. It was just low hanging fruit, immediately accessible, and immediately connected me with multiple dimensions on which healing entities and beings, but also negative parasitic entities exist. So it was like a hint of the 6-foot end of the swimming pool, multidimensionality, and the entities and beings that inhabit it. So, I think a lot of people who set out on the grimoire path want to have that kind of interaction, but healing work is just so fast. It's just it's just so rapid descent into and ascent into as well the world of otherworldly beings, dimensions, karma, and it's intrinsically positive. It's always good. So that for me was the path. It's not for everyone, I guess. So that's all I'd like to add.
I love that. Shattering something being too close or too remote, just doing it and embarking. That physicality
Yeah.
is wonderful.
Yeah.
So, Peter, as we wrap up here, I have two kind of final questions for you, which is by the time people see this or hear it, it'll be either right after the Occulture conference in Berlin or it'll
Yeah.
be during. So can you preview kind of some of the current talks and issues and things that you're thinking about, but also can you give us a hint? Yeah, because you're always working on upcoming books, upcoming research. Any hints or teasings that you can give to us would be always appreciated.
We actually covered some of this today. I'm deep into the issue of visual culture and visuality, and for instance, and looking at the archaic sites of Anatolia. For instance, the Hittite sacred site, Yazilekaya, which is a natural stone star temple. And then looking further afield towards Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, those places, Çatalhöyük, I'm asking this question as to what was the relationship between the night skies and their ritual understanding, for instance. How did that emerge? And there's been a lot of speculation about constellations, but did they have our conception of the constellations? Because it looks like that emerged or evolved very late in human development. Okay. On the other hand, the Pleiades, for instance, seem to have been recognized by 80 to 90% of what we would call them hunter-gatherer cultures worldwide. So why, or you know, what was the centrality of that particular constellation? Why, very early in human spiritual development, did it become a focus? And so these are the kind of questions I'm engaged with at the moment. It emerged out of I received an email just as I was finishing the ritual and Epiphany in the Mysteries of Mithras. Somebody wrote to me and said, do you realize that if you look at the night skies as they probably would have been visible to somebody in early centuries, you can actually see the tauroctony, the bull killing scene? And I said, he said, yeah, amongst the nebula and dark avenues and so on and so forth, you can visualize it there. And that kicked off or initiated a whole train of thought about the relationship between the skies as they were in the remote past and the evolution of human spiritual life. And what was the connection? Because, I mean, all of us can immediately say, oh, yes, that's obvious. But then when you try and articulate what it was, you kind of run into a wall because our own connection with the night skies has become so remote visually and culturally, and because most of us live in cities and whatever. So there's a deep question as to how that has informed the imaginary of the mystery cults over a vast aeon of time. Because, the bull of heaven in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is a reference to Taurus. And where the bull is stabbed in the shoulder, by the way, that's not how you sacrifice a bull. You don't stab it in the shoulder, is where the Pleiades are situated. So what was it about that star cluster in terms of our spiritual evolution that made it so important? So this is the question I'm pursuing at the moment, and looking again at the ancient Bronze Age and pre-pottery Neolithic sites of Anatolia. So this will be rolling out throughout next year, and try and sort out, how do we think about this? What are the relevant concepts? And how does that inform our understanding of our spiritual evolution? Yeah.
I love that, Peter. Well, I know myself, and I'm sure the listeners will be keeping our ear to the ground on the latest
Well,
updates.
any of you guys want to come over to explore these sites with me, please let me know.
Oh, you do not. Hey, you do not have to ask me twice. Do not tempt me. Are you kidding me? I should start looking at plane tickets right now.
Yeah.
Though
The only
that's
thing it would be earliest spring, latest autumn next year. Autumn next year would be good. It needs to be late in the year
mm,
because the temperatures down there, midsummer around Göbekli Tepe are 55 degrees. You know, it's not sustainable. So you need to go like November. Perfect time. You know, anyway, that's a possibility. I will certainly be pursuing that.
excellent. So listen,
That's like, you know, that's where my head is at the moment.
absolutely love it. So listeners, stay tuned, because if we get if there's any more information on how you can potentially link up with Peter, that would be great. So certainly stay tuned for that.
And also, if any of them want to see the presentation I'll give at our culture of the ritual stages, we can do that. If any of your gang are interested in that, they should let you know, right?
100%. I can only guess that they are screaming right now at the computer screen. Alex, you idiot! The only logical answer is yes, and of course it is. So yes, Peter, that would be wonderful. So,
save them a trip across the Atlantic, of course. Save some money.
touche. Well, always challenging us, always sharing his latest research, and encouraging us to start the path, to walk the path, to collapse the perception of time. Author, healer, researcher, poet, essayist, among a constellation of other things. His latest tome is Ritual and Epiphany and the Mysteries of Mithras, the Secret Cult of Saturn and Imperial Rome. None other than Peter Mark Adams. Peter, thank you just so much again, as always, for generously sharing your time and your wisdom on the show today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Always a pleasure, Alex.